very close. Okay, so I've got, I think because you said that, my first question is kind of a general one. It's like, since you co-chair the Green Software Foundation, would you mind telling us just a little bit about its goals that you're like most excited about / most concerned about / you're just kind of focused on whether or not you are and why? You can pick one.
So which goal am I most? So it's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm generally the GSF. I'm very generally very glad that the GSF exists and the CNCF environmental tag, because fundamentally the goal is just to normalise being green and getting your systems ready for the energy transition, which is coming. So and things have to be changed in order to have systems that will run on low carbon or zero carbon electricity. So I'm incredibly excited by anyone who's talking about that and saying that this is something that we need to do. The CNCF are taking one tack, which I like. I like that we take two different tacks. The CNCF tag group is more open, more go out and push it out in the way that the CNCF always have been. The GSF, it wouldn't have been my choice. It's a bit more focused on the internal, on the members that are already members. They're kind of taking a slow burn approach, and yeah, I'm glad that both approaches exist, even though they're somewhat complementary.
Great. Yeah. All right, so I have a fun one. Given the approaches that you're talking about, okay, I'm just gonna plead ignorance here if I'm completely wrong about this, but my impression as someone who's interested but not necessarily spending a lot of time either in the GSF or the environmental sustainability tag, at least recently, my impression is that there's a one-to-one almost relationship between saving on energy, let's say having metrics that show you how much energy you're using that to help reduce your workloads, and the one-to-one relationship between that and cost savings and like money. And so because of that, I think it's probably obvious that businesses whose sole purpose is to make money have an incentive to go greener for that reason. But what we're already starting to see is that there are, and I think this is a fantastic thing, but just there are regions, for example, there are more green regions, right, where they're actually using ecologically sound production of energy to actually power the cloud region. So you can do that, and you don't. And there are more things like that, right? Like Uber is making a green car more available. Google's showing you the energy emissions, or the CO2 at least emissions, for flights that you can choose from, and there's no real significant cost difference there. Whereas for most of the other things, like running cloud workloads, there is cost. My question is, as we hope that increases, or at least I do, what kinds of incentives do you think we could put into place, or are there any strategies from your side on how we can encourage businesses to keep caring when there's not a one-to-one relationship with saving money?
Well, actually, even where there is a one-to-one, so there are two levers that you can pull to be green. The first is that you can just use less electricity, which is, as you say, the efficiency thing. You use less electricity, you use less hardware. That's greener, and it saves you money. So that's, in some ways, that's the easy sell. The other thing you can do is you can shift to places where the grid is lower carbon, so has lower carbon intensity. So that's running at a certain time, and carbon intensity varies in all grids, geographically and also over time. So, but generally speaking, there are green grids that are always greener than others. So, and interestingly, for all kinds of different reasons. So in Europe is a particularly interesting one. If you're interested in this, you should have a look at a site called electricitymaps.com, which gives you pictures of how green the grid is for almost every country in the world. and historic data as well as real-time data. And it's really interesting. It's fascinating to see the difference between different countries. But as I say, the countries can vary for a wide variety of reasons. So, for example, in Europe, France is very green, has a very low carbon grid because there's a load of nuclear powering the grid. It's loads of nuclear energy production. Scandinavia in Europe is very green because there's lots of hydropower. Spain is increasingly green for completely different reasons. So in Spain, they've done an awful lot of building up of solar and wind, and they've been doing an awful lot of hydro storage, so pumped hydro storage. So the interesting thing is that countries tend to be green or not green in different ways. A lot of those scale. So Spain, I think, has a good chance of being able to continue to be green and provide more and more green power. France, unless they build more nuclear, they're probably going to eventually. There's going to be a limit to how much green power they can produce. But fundamentally, one of the easiest things that you can do to be greener is move and run your systems in countries with a green grid, as indicated on electricity maps. But as you say, that doesn't always mean that it's cheaper. There are some countries where the green power is cheaper and some countries where it isn't. One thing that is being produced, which is being rolled out all over the world, is something called dynamic tariffs. And dynamic tariffs are where the cost, the price you pay for electricity varies depending on how green that electricity is through the day and through different seasons. So as I said, I mentioned Spain. Spain is a country with dynamic tariffs. Quite a few Scandinavian countries have dynamic tariffs. And there is a motivation, there is an incentive for homes and businesses to shift their work to times when there is green power available. And I think that most people believe that eventually dynamic tariffs are going to roll out everywhere. It's slow in some places. I know that in the UK, for example, there's a fear that people have to be quite savvy to work with, have to be quite smart, have to be quite technically literate to handle dynamic tariffs, and they worry that people will just behave exactly as they do now and suddenly end up with an unexpectedly high bill because they ran their washing machine in the middle of the night or whatever. So there's a worry. There can be some hesitance in rolling out dynamic tariffs, but eventually they are coming. There's no doubt about that. And then that will align being green with cost savings. Which is what you're asking about. But the interesting question is, will it? Because as you say, operational efficiency particularly and code efficiency both already save you money, but not everybody does it because it requires investment of time and energy by developers to be more efficient. And quite often people will just pay the additional cost to save their developers time. So it's not always a done deal that just because it will save you money, companies will adopt operational efficiency, for example. So it's an interesting question. I really, eventually dynamic tariffs will come, but will they be enough in and of themselves?
I've got a ton of questions. Does anyone else have one? So don't
The dynamic tariffs are dynamic tariffs are charged by the data centers?
No, so at the moment, dynamic tariffs are charged by energy companies. So the data centers would experience the dynamic tariffs. And then sometimes so at the moment, interestingly, even in countries where there are dynamic tariffs, I don't believe they're passed on to customers. So I don't think people like AWS pass on those dynamic tariffs even where they're experiencing it. Because I spoke to an AWS person last month, and they were saying they were bemoaning the fact that dynamic tariffs were not something that they offered on AWS because they would have quite liked it. So yeah, I don't think that data centers are passing that on, but that's something that that energy companies are in those countries.
Right, right. What was your name? Dan. Dan, yeah. Dan was just saying it's like on and off peak.
It's exactly like on and off peak, except in the smarter countries, it's happening every half hour.
Okay. Gotcha.
It's interesting, like most data center have electricity generation ability. So when there is a dynamic tariff, why don't I just generate my own electricity? Well, it could be cheaper. So. But it's you might be using fossil fuel, so that's a bad thing. So
Yeah, so you have to be careful. I mean, it is always worth asking the question of your data center is what's their energy policy? Where do they get their energy from? And you know, what are their plans for the future? Are they intending to get it off from? Are they at least buying RECs or you know offsetting in some way or paying for power purchase agreements and things like that? How are they going to guarantee that they provide green power for you in the future? And what services are they going to provide that will allow you to flex your workloads and shift your workloads forward or backwards in time to take advantage of when there's cheap electricity and steer away from where there's dirty, expensive electricity?
I have a question.
There's one question here first, and then you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And feel free to introduce yourself, but I asked you without actually, I figured you had the right to say no. but if you want to introduce yourself, everyone, please do.
Ed, software engineer, now work at Capital One, previously at startups. When I had little money, optimizing my cloud bill was very relevant for me. But it seems that overall in the industry, most companies, they think that investing engineering time in product development has a higher return on investment. Except there are extreme cases where you're OpenAI and you're spending how many hundreds of millions of training LLM, and so you're gonna do performance optimization. So I was curious to hear what you think about the role of cloud vendors, because I think if they had better support for doing this with less effort from companies, then I would imagine that everybody would say yes if I had a better way. But it's like they don't have the incentive because they make money out of your workload, right? So
yeah, I agree. It would be lovely if the cloud vendors gave you more tools to be green, which are basically more tools to save money when you're running in the cloud. Because you're quite right. In my experience, if they can, companies will just say, don't spend the time optimizing, we'll pay that bill. We'd rather that you were developing new features instead. So we've got to make it so that it's incredibly easy to optimize. We've got to make it easy.
Okay,
I just have a follow-up question on that one. Is there a regulation coming in terms of the restricting the usage of too many electricity in the training QLLM model, like mining Bitcoin?
Yes, there is. There's new legislation coming for all goods that are exported into the EU. It's called the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And the CBAM will basically fine you for they'll make you report your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions in order to sell to EU citizens. And so it's a bit like the GDPR. Yeah, if you have a user, even if you're an online service, if you have a user in the EU, you'll have to comply with these rules. And you'll have to report your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and then you'll pay a cost based on what your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions are. And it will be quite a high cost because the EU are mandating lowering carbon bills for their own customers, for their own companies in the EU. And they obviously don't want companies from outside the EU undercutting based on not having to go through all that difficulty of minimizing their carbon bills. So yeah, the CBAM is coming. We don't know exactly when it's going to hit software services, internet services, but we know it will be at some point within the next 9 years, probably about 5 years-ish, maybe less than that. And it will be quite expensive. It will be radical when it happens. So that's definitely going to change behavior.
Okay, we've got a couple of hands. I just want to make sure to keep track of them right. Like you were first, and what's your name?
My name is Adam.
Adam. Hey, and then you, and then I think Dan. Okay, Dan. Right. Okay. Okay.
Thanks, and I was at QCon last, and the one in what was it, Chicago? I think Chicago, right? Yeah, Chicago. The one at Chicago QCon had a really big focus on the green software movements. I think that sounds like it's been spearheaded by your team, and I'd love to see that. So my first question aligned directly to the CNCF, and if anyone knows in here, feel free to answer. Are there any specific OSS projects that are aligned to your metrics and your indices that you feel could be critical for keeping folks accountable? Like, you know, because if the hyperscaler isn't going to push out an open source project that does some of this recommendation, you know, is there someone or a project that you've seen in the community that sticks out in a positive way?
Well, I think the GSF is doing the carbon impact framework, which I think everybody has quite high hopes for. The CNCF are starting to roll out carbon reviews. The trouble is, it's quite early days. I think we are just going to have to put pressure on the cloud vendors, the hypercloud vendors ourselves, and say, look, we really, really want this. The most shouting I have ever seen recently on this subject was from an AWS internal conference that they did for AWS customers in London about a month ago. And they had some folk over from France who were saying to AWS, we need you have to give us better reporting, because the EU is now demanding scope 3 reporting from our AWS systems, and you do not provide it. And this is absolutely terrible. And the room was up in arms supporting them. So there is certainly pressure that's coming by way of the new EU rules that AWS customers are shouting about this stuff. And we do know that AWS do care about what their customers think. So I think that is probably where most of the pressure is going to come from. I don't know I know that there are some rules in California now. I don't know if any of you folk know what those rules are, or have you heard about pressure being applied to AWS or Azure or Google because of them yet?
No, not me. Wow.
No, in that case, they're probably much less aggressive than the European regulations.
Sure. And before we move on to the next person, I just wanted to mention that the next agenda slot after Anne is going to be someone from the CNCF environmental sustainability tag, and we are going to mention projects like that do what you asked about. So Kepler is one of the main ones, and they're going to note a few others. So that's kind of like where the handshake, I think, with Green Software Foundation and CNCF go. CNCF is largely at this point focusing on things like cloud native software specifically to help with this, and Green Software Foundation is taking on other pieces.
Perfect.
And did I get kind of that right? I don't want to mischaracterize GSF.
Yeah, no, I'd say that's a fair statement, that the CNCF are particularly focusing on Kubernetes. So I mean, it's a really good match up with this meetup. And Kepler is very interesting indeed. But I would say that you're still putting, in order to really put pressure on the hypercloud providers, it has to be customers it has to be higher up in the business than just developers. I think it has to be procurement departments and things saying, well, look, we've got to have this reporting, we've got to have better numbers, we've got to have better tools for getting our numbers down, because we have to report this to the EU, and they're going to find us quite badly if we don't.
I had a question, like, going back a little bit. So, do we actually know, like, percentage-wise, like, how much money the cloud providers spend on electricity? We were talking about electricity, and I really don't know. Operational cost-wise, is it the 1%, 10%, or 30%? So, do we know that number? How much money goes on electricity of what we pay?
I think it's more in the 1%. I think I saw some numbers recently that puts it in the couple of percent. It's between 1% and 10%, but I think it's at the lower end of that. So it's not their biggest expense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Then I think you wanted to go get Dan, right? I think. Or you had a question, you still did.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of a two-part question because, like, there was a great article in the Washington Post about AI data centers and all that. So it says the planned data centers just in Northern Virginia need about 7 nuclear reactors to power them. So, how do you feel about that? Is nuclear actually green?
Is AI going to kill us all by
one way or another? Right?
an incredible number of gas-fired power stations to power it? I think the jury is still completely out on that. I mean, there's some really good possibilities with AI. So one of the things we've talked about is that renewables are not uniformly distributed in space or time. There are some places where there's loads of renewables and others where there really isn't any at all. So it's really useful to have forms of battery, ways by which I mean ways that you can store power. You can effectively convert power into something that you can use later. You might say that training AI models is a form of battery. It's not real time. You don't need to. You could do it while the sun's shining and the wind's blowing, and not do it at other times. So there are good aspects to AI. It doesn't necessarily need to overload the grid. It could be a really good pairing. At least the training could be a really good pairing for solar farms or wind farms. But inference is generally more real time at the moment. So that's on demand. That's not necessarily a good pairing with renewables, which are highly variable in their availability. Having said that, all of these things are at a very early stage. Inference at the moment is a bit real time, but it doesn't have to be. If we were quite careful about it, I'm pretty sure we'd be able to I bet that 80% of queries against AI models are utterly predictable. They're probably almost exactly the same. So you could just pre-calculate them, cache them, and AI. You don't have to necessarily return exactly the question that was asked. You could return a question that is similar to an answer to a question that is similar to the question that was asked. So there's lots of ways that you can effectively CDN it, I would say, with inference, and we'll probably have to go down that road. So it all just depends how cleverly we do AI, whether we design AI from the start to be runnable on renewable power, or whether we say, we can't be bothered, we're just going to run it the same way so we've always run everything, as if there's always electricity available and it's always identical. So AI, I would love to see it go in the direction of good, not in the direction of fossil fuels, but the jury's still out, so it could go either way. There is one thing that makes me a little bit happier about AI, and that is at the moment it's massively limited by lack of TPUs and GPUs, which means that people are putting a hell of a lot of effort into making the models more efficient because there's a shortage of hardware to run it on. Eventually, there'll be loads of hardware, but at least some investment is going in at this point on making it more efficient because there's a lack of hardware. That can sometimes drive efficiency in a way that nothing else can.
I really, Well, I was just going to say, I really like the way you phrased that, that we are running it as if electricity is unlimited, which isn't really a debatable statement, but it somehow has almost, I don't know, like the power of fiction or something to it, you know, because it's so, we have such an idea that we do have these, that we do have this as an unlimited resource. Anyway, that was more of a statement than a question, but I know that we have just, Ariel has a question, and I know that we're about to your time that you wanted to go to. We could certainly go a little bit longer, but I want to be respectful of your bedtime. Yeah.
I don't mind. I don't mind going a bit longer. I'm awake now.
Okay, great. And then was there someone else before you? I think it was. Okay, and then yeah. So did you have a question?
Yeah, so I was just going to follow us. I think it'd be interesting to take a poll in the room. So I personally think nuclear is considered green. I don't know what everybody else thinks. So. Okay.
And also thorium is a more safe
Right,
model.
thorium, right, the reactor,
reactors I'm
right.
looking into. If anybody hasn't already, thorium reactors are really interesting.
Yeah, but
It's also like compared to what, right? It's not like an
Compared to-
absolute green, not green.
Right.
Like you can,
It's a range.
yeah.
But it's a discussion that I think needs to be revisited now as we look at the proliferation of the data centers. And I'm ex-Microsoft, so like it's a lot of energy. I don't know the exact percentages, but it's a lot of energy.
Yeah, and if we look at utility is always about 10 years behind the current usage. So if I'm a power plant, I guess an operator, and you told me you're gonna need 100 megawatt, it's gonna take me X amount of year to build that capacity. But it's so with AI ramping up, where we're gonna find those extra electricity from, so.
It's parabolic.
Yeah. And I think, initially when we build data center, we build it near the internet exchange point. So we're closer to the network. Then we build it close to the eyeball, low latency. And I think the next step is that we're gonna build data center where it's close to the powers.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that. So something that's really well worth looking into is, I don't know if you're familiar with the site Our World in Data, which produces really interesting charts about what's going on in the world data-wise. If you look at the Our World in Data charts for solar energy generation globally, you'll see something extremely interesting, which is that solar energy generation is going up exponentially. It's like exponential growth. It's not only for pandemics; it is also for solar power generation. And there is going to be a lot of power available through solar, but only at certain times and in certain places. But if we can put our data centers in those times and places, there should be plenty of power to run jobs that are latency insensitive.
My question is a follow-up on those a little bit, which is as adoption increases, what prescriptive architectures or best practices could exist to help inform developers so that we're not seeing, like I saw a cloud vendor, smaller one, just pumping like, we have a bunch of NVIDIA H100s, come train your models, and not really assessing whether do I need to train a model, or am I better served leveraging a foundational model and using different approaches like RAG that gets a lot of attention now to address my needs. So is there any guidance that exists as to how I build out my systems or develop my software in a way that is sensitive to the environment?
Well, we've got AI training isn't my area of expertise, but one of my co-authors, there is a section on AI in the Arola book, Building Green Software, and that does give some kind of basic stuff in there. But I would also have a chat to. I don't know if you run on AWS. It's well worth having a chat to their sustainability team, because they are pretty good. And they really do care. There aren't that many of them, but if you can get through to them, which you should be able to do if you agitate a bit, then they will give you good advice on what to do. I think everybody is. The good thing about AI at the moment is that everybody's so panicked about lack of access to the relevant hardware that they're much more worried about efficiency than you might think. They're quite focused on how we use it in ways that are as efficient as possible, given that there's such a lack of it. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Rather than training an entire model from scratch, you are better off if you can using existing models. I think there are places like Hugging Face that have existing models that you can kind of tune rather than have to redo from scratch. That I mean, the less you do, the greener it is. So if you can reuse rather than have to retrain everything from scratch, it's good. But as I say, retraining from scratch is not necessarily a terrible thing to do, as long as you do it when the sun's shining or the wind's blowing in a green region. It is the classic latency insensitive workload. We just have to make sure we always do things in a latency insensitive way if we possibly can. I mean, generally there's a kind of two it depends. If you are a non-vendor, if you're developing software that's going to be deployed at scale, then there's one set of things you're going to have to do. You're going to have to write your code to be efficient so that when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, it uses as little energy as possible. And you're going to have to write your platforms. And if you're a vendor, you're producing platforms effectively that other people are using. You're going to have to make it so that your platforms offer features that easily allow your customers to shift work in time or space. So efficiency and ability to shift and shape. If you're an enterprise, if you're somebody who's just using software but you're not developing it yourself, then really my main advice that I give to people is just be very good at operations. Just be very good at using the platform that you are running on, because there's no point in it's not up to you then to write ridiculously efficient code. You want to be running on a platform that will be as efficient as possible under your feet and keep getting more efficient, and give you the option to demand shift and demand shape. So the behavior that you need to adopt is very dependent upon whether or not you are effectively a user of platforms or a developer of platforms. And life is going to get much harder for developers of platforms so that we can make it not so hard for users of platforms. Because, I mean, let's face it, efficiency is expensive, so it only really pays off if you've got some scale.
I just wanted to do a shout out. There was ThoughtWorks did a podcast 3 years ago about green software engineering, if anyone's interested in it. They talk about, and this is before the big AI buzz really started. So.
I'll have to check that out. Bill?
Now you're saying efficiency is expensive for developers because there's so much work to fix wasteful software. A good chunk of what's running in the cloud is open source software. And I'm guessing that some of it is highly optimized, like Postgres. Little teeny tiny latency gets rabbit holed until you discover a backdoor. And yet there's other applications that nobody's looking at because nobody's really investing in open source software. I'm wondering if there's any kind of places where you feel like people should look for the best opportunities where essentially the market failure of companies not collaborating to fund improvements to open source has left the best opportunities for saving carbon.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm sure that will certainly be the case. That anything that you can do there's no incentive for open source companies to tune and make things more efficient. It's interesting that some that some open source projects are really investing in efficiency and some aren't. So it used to be a massive joke that Python was really inefficient, and it still is pretty inefficient. But it's oddly enough, it's becoming vastly more efficient under the feet of everybody who uses Python, because a lot of their core libraries are being rewritten in Rust, and then with a Python wrappers. If you talk to Python users and they're keeping up with the latest releases, they say every time a new release comes out, it's vastly more efficient than it was before. Suddenly all their code becomes vastly more efficient and more performant than it was previously. And we have to assume that's because a lot of Python is now used a lot in AI and ML, and there's just pressure for that code to become more efficient. And there is the story there. Pressure is coming from the users of that open source code for the code to become more efficient and more performant. Because efficiency in code efficiency and code performance are pretty highly correlated. So it's all down to the combo of a lot of pressure from users who really need the performance or whatever, or the cost effectiveness, whatever, combined with the open source project having enough maintainers and enough resources behind it to pay for the work to make it more efficient. So yeah, you're right. Where there are things that there just aren't the people behind it to make it more efficient, then it doesn't matter how much pressure is put on, it's never going to become more efficient. But as users, the best that we can do is often just put a lot of pressure on and see what happens, and look at what their plans are, look at what they're doing. Are they becoming more efficient under the cover, under your feet, fundamentally? If they're not, then maybe you need to move to a different open source platform that is. And unfortunately, that sometimes means that you're moving to one that seems more evil on the surface of it. I was talking to somebody the other day who actually was the chap who was telling me about Python becoming much more efficient under his feet, saying that he was a data scientist, used Python, and he also used Julia. And he was saying that Julia was originally, they went with Julia because it was an incredibly, the people seemed really committed to being green, and it was all going to be super efficient and all that kind of stuff. But in the end, Julia just hasn't had the money behind it to become efficient in the way that Python, which wasn't particularly advertising itself as being green or particularly carbon aware, has. So Python just got ahead of Julia. Sometimes money speaks louder than intentions.
That was so great. I love it. Thank you so much, Anne. This is really amazing.
and now at midnight, I will go to bed.
We'll see. I was going to say hopefully see you soon, but I don't really want to wish the extra jet fuel. But if we do happen to be in each other's countries, it would be nice to get a tea.
Yes, yeah. One day we will all be in the same place. But enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.